Today's episode of The Conservative Rebel is based on an article I recently published on the Evandish Substack. Go to evanjdish.substack.com to access more great free content like this. Link will be in the description. Now, let's get to the episode. As recently as 80 years ago, America and European countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were imperial powers who ruled half of all land on Earth. Britain alone controlled a quarter of the globe, boasting the greatest empire in world history. But immediately after World War II, in the prime of their lives, these empires simply gave up on themselves. Over the next couple decades, they frantically withdrew from all their former colonies. They freely chose to demote themselves from world powers to international laughingstocks, fated to slowly die from managed decline. This had never happened before in all of human history. Many empires had fallen, but never because they chose to. Why would any nation do this to itself? The answer is simple. The liberal intelligentsia decided at that moment that Western colonialism was racist and wrong. Every people had the right to govern itself as an independent nation-state. It was unjust for Britain to colonize India, for example, because Indians were a distinct nation. Now, the word nation has been redefined in our age to mean country or government or some vague legal entity. In our especially ridiculous case in America, our nation has been redefined to be an abstract idea floating around in the ether. But the word nation doesn't mean that. A nation can't be any of those things for the same reason that a machine gun can't be a cupcake. Because nations, like machine guns, have definitions. They're actually a real thing, which means they're not other things. And here's the definition of the word nation. The word nation comes from the Latin word natio, which means by birth or to be born. You can look that up. For this reason, until approximately 5 seconds ago, the word nation has always meant a people, an ethnic and cultural group. And this is the definition of the word nation we'll use here, because it's the only real definition of a nation. Each nation, according to the liberal anti-imperialists, who accepted this definition back then more or less, deserved to have its own state or government so it could rule itself free of outside interference. This is the liberal principle of self-determination, national self-determination. And because Indians were a unique nation, with a unique ancestry, heritage, and way of life, they had a right to an independent Indian state. And the British Empire was depriving them of this right, so it needed to leave, according to the liberal calculus. This logic was applied to every nation that any European country colonized, or that America colonized, for example, the Philippines. They all deserved independence, and they all deserved it instantly, and to hell with the consequences, which were often catastrophic. In the case of India, it evolved into a very bloody civil war in which untold numbers of people were killed. Similar story played out in lots of places. And the reason I bring up all this historical background about empires and nations and how they fell isn't because I'm a massive history nerd who wants to rant into the void about the collapse of the West. Or at least that's not the only reason. The reason I bring it up is because it's extremely relevant to our modern immigration debate. These liberal principles of national self-determination and anti-colonialism, if taken seriously and if applied consistently, are incompatible with the liberal agenda of open borders and mass migration. Because if you apply this logic consistently, so it doesn't exclude white people for no reason at all, it will make 100% of the liberals who claim to believe in it recoil in abject horror. Not only that, it will drive plenty of so-called conservatives who also claim to believe in these principles to decry you as a racist and white nationalist, whatever that is even supposed to mean. Because just like Indians deserved their own nation, the British and Germans, and yes, Americans, are also distinct ethno-cultural groups. If Indians deserve their own nation for that reason, then so do white Brits and Germans, and so do Americans, the people who have been here for hundreds of years. If Indians had the right to self-determination, so do we. Mass migration is colonization. Mass migration deprives nations of their sovereign rights to an independent nation state, under the liberal logic. The Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary offers this as a definition of colonize. Quote, to migrate to and settle in an inhabited or uninhabited area, to establish a colony in. The third world immigrants flooding into America and Europe are definitely migrating to and settling in, quote-unquote, other nations' lands, just as this definition stipulates. They are colonizing it, in other words. They are colonizing Britain. They are colonizing France. They are colonizing Germany. And yes, they are colonizing America. And in such great numbers. They're doing it to such an extent and to such a wide scale that it's only a matter of time before they outnumber the indigenous peoples of Europe, who are white people. And by 2045, these people will surpass white Americans. They will be more than 50% of the population whose families have lived here for centuries. So if it was unjust for Europeans to colonize Africa, then it's also unjust for Africans to colonize Europe. If the Europeans needed to be driven out of the lands that they colonized, then the third world immigrants who are coming here need to be deported from America and Europe all the same. And if that's racist, then the reasons for decolonizing India and Africa were also racist. If that's ethno-nationalism, then apparently everyone alive today is an ethno-nationalist. Maybe not a consistent one. Maybe they only apply it to people who aren't white, because applying it to white people would be mean or something. But if that's ethno-nationalism, then everyone alive today is that towards African nations, etc. And this is the beautiful thing about universal claims and universal principles, like colonialism is bad and nations deserve their independence. This is the thing you cannot escape. Universal principles apply universally, hence the universal, it's right there in the name, even to people who have a lighter skin pigmentation than liberals would prefer. But this picture somehow gets worse when you compare third world colonialism to historic Western colonialism. Because this is not just morally equivalent to what Europe did in Africa. This is worse than what Europe did to Africa, and I'm going to explain why. Throughout human history, colonial empires have almost always been more culturally and technologically advanced than whatever nation they were colonizing. Europe was more advanced than Africa, light years more advanced. Sorry, Britain was more advanced than the Indian tribes that were living in North America when the whole process of colonization started there. Sorry, these are facts. Might not like them, but they're facts. And the fact that the colonizing nations were more advanced than the nations being colonized shouldn't be surprising. Advanced nations, by virtue of being more advanced, were almost impossible for primitive nations to fend off in battle. That meant advanced nations tended to be the colonizers, and primitive nations tended to be the ones who got colonized. And because of this, colonialism always had a silver lining, even for the nation being colonized. Their standard of living, economy, infrastructure, education, and political stability were all going to improve. A better way of living, better technology, better law, all of this was going to come to them. They were going to be lifted up out of poverty and out of anarchy and out of chaos oftentimes. When the West first colonized Africa, they found barbaric tribal societies that had barely advanced beyond the Stone Age. But they left it with roads, cars, electricity, running water, telegraph and telephone lines, cities, schools, and churches. When they got there, it was people running around half naked, in some cases literally eating each other. And this is what they left it with. A clear improvement. And if they had stayed in Africa for longer, there's no doubt that they would have built more of these things. They would have made the standard of living better, and that continent would be a lot less impoverished and war-torn than it is today. All those civil wars that are happening in Sudan, you think if Europe was still in charge of it, that would be happening? No. That was another nice thing about colonialism. They kept the various tribes and religious and ethnic groups from killing each other. They kept the peace. So when the West colonized Africa, they brought benefits, they brought advancement. But when third worlders colonize the West, as they are doing today, they are not bringing any technological or cultural advancement with them. They aren't coming to build up a primitive civilization and make it safer and more prosperous. Instead, these colonizers are coming from nations that are infinitely less advanced than the ones they are colonizing. They bring increased crime, increased chaos, increased tribalism, fraud, and racial tensions to the places they're settling in. They don't raise the standard of living of the nations that they are colonizing. Instead, they make the indigenous people's lives measurably worse and a lot more dangerous. They're not bringing civilization to a place where it doesn't exist, but destroying civilization in a place where it does. Look at what's happening to Europe. Look at Henry Novak. Look at the guy who almost got beheaded in the streets of Belfast recently. Is this advancement? Look at London. Is London better than it was 100 years ago? The truth is that the age of colonial empire never ended. As soon as the West stopped colonizing the Third World, at that exact moment, its leaders opened the floodgates for the Third World to colonize the West. Mass migration isn't just colonialism, but the worst form of colonialism imaginable. It has all of the worst aspects of it without any of the upsides. And yet, the people most dedicated to villainizing America and the rest of the West for its historical imperialism are strangely silent on this crisis. They have nothing to say, they have nothing to condemn, because they don't actually have any consistent principles on this or any other topic. They just hate white people, hate the West, and want to harm both of them as much as they possibly can. And until the people of the West can summon the courage to defend their nations and to defend their civilization, even if that means being called racist, there's nothing standing in the way of that goal. Thanks for listening to The Conservative Rebel. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to go over to the Evan Dish Substack and subscribe over there. That's where I put out most of the stuff I put out, and it's all free, it's all ad-free, and it's all great stuff that you'll really like. So I highly encourage you to go over there. I'll see you next time.